Hey everybody, welcome to the webinar. It's Chris Widener. I'm super excited about hosting this webinar because it's about something that I'm really passionate about, and that's writing books. I've written, if you include ebooks and things like that, I think I'm at 20 or 21 books. I think it's like 12 or 13 actual hard copy physical books that I've done. 13 languages my books have been translated into, 3 million copies in print. And frankly, writing a book and writing books has changed my life. It's been the driving factor for my life. It's taken me all over the world to travel. I mean, Russia, Singapore, China, Australia, Spain, Egypt, all over the world traveling. Why? Because I wrote books and people read my books and they hired me to come and speak. It created me as an expert in the marketplace. And I know better than anybody what writing books can do. It provides you great income, not only from the book royalties, but also from the speeches that you give and the consulting projects that you get. And so I'm excited just to host this webinar with a good friend of mine and my publisher, Bryan Heathman of Made for Success Publishing. Bryan, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, you bet, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you here today.
Awesome. So I'm excited about this because people who are here, they're saying, yeah, I want to write a book, or I've thought seriously about writing a book, or I'd like to become a speaker or a consultant or an author. It may be somebody that says, you know what, I'm 80 years old and I've got great stories from, my life and I want my family to see it as a legacy piece. Or it might be a business person who wants to create more credibility in the marketplace. Might be somebody who wants to become a speaker. A lot of different reasons for writing a book, but a lot of people just say, I don't know how to do it. In fact, I always tell people, if you ever want to strike up a conversation with somebody, ask them this: have you ever thought about writing a book? And almost everybody says yes. And I remember one time I was standing in the lobby of a luxury condominium place here in Scottsdale, and I was telling somebody that, and they're like, that's not true. I turned to the bellhop and I said, you ever thought about writing a book? He goes, actually, I have thought about writing a book. The crazy stories that happen in this place. Everybody has thought about writing a book. And so the people that are here with us on this webinar are thinking about writing a book. Now, because most people don't know how to start, you've developed something for those people, and it's called Draft a Book Experience, the Draft a Book Experience. And that's what I want to talk about today, and all the components of the Draft a Book Experience. But each one of those is very practical. So people, you're not going to get a big sales pitch here. You're going to get actionable information that you can take and learn and grow and understand the process for getting your book. But it comes from what Bryan and his team do with authors, which is called the Draft a Book Experience. Before you write it, you got to know where you're going. Stephen Covey said in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, they begin with the end in mind. And so this whole process is about beginning with the end in mind before you even start. So Bryan, why don't you give us a 30,000 foot view of the Draft a Book Experience that you and your team do with authors, and then let's dive into the many steps that you cover in that process.
Yeah, that sounds great, Chris. So, when you're setting out to write a book, especially as you're looking at your New Year's resolutions and the things that you want to do to improve yourself or to grow your business, there's many different ways to get started writing a book. In fact, you could go to iTunes and do a search on Draft a Book in a Day and pick up audio programs. You can go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon. You can find books about how to write a book, and there's just countless resources. There's people that I know that do authors workshops in exotic places where you can learn to write a book. But this approach that we're talking about, Chris, is a little bit different. And we call it the Draft a Book Experience because the experience is set here in an environment where we leave nothing to chance. So, Chris, I loved it, the fact that you referenced, let's look at this from a 30,000 foot view. Well, I'm going to have us look at this from a 14,000 foot view. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, so I live in Seattle. And right outside of Seattle is a mountain. It's a big one called Mount Rainier. In fact, when you're flying into Seattle, most likely you'll see this out of the window as you're flying in. Now, there's 2 different ways that you can climb Mount Rainier. you can go to a outdoor sporting goods store like REI, and you can buy a book on how to climb Mount Rainier, and it'll tell you about the guide, or all the different paths that you can take to go up the mountain. Or you can hire a mountaineer that will tell you what gear you need to do, what your training regimen, so that you'll have a successful climb, what time of year to go up the mountain, and a number of different technical variables. And that they make sure that you get up safely, and they make sure that you get down the mountain safely. So the drafted book experience is for the author. It's designed for the author who wants to leave nothing to chance. And in fact, they want to write a book that has bestseller potential right out of the gate. And because there's, I don't think a single person with an English literature degree has come through the drafted book experience here at the Heathman Ranch, where people stay when they come to Seattle. And what we need to do is we need to figure out how to make you, whether you're an expert in a medical field or an expert in a legal field, or you're the CEO of a company, or you're an athlete, we need to take you through a system that will make you an exceptional writer.
Now, you mentioned athletes. Let me jump in real quick.
Yeah.
I know that you've worked with a ton of people, business people and athletes. One of the guys that went through your program is a guy named Todd Stottlemyre. And Todd is the son of Mel Stottlemyre, the New York Yankee Hall of Famer. Todd was an amazing baseball player in and of himself. He won 3 World Series, I think 2 with the Blue Jays and 1 with the Diamondbacks. Great guy. He went through this process with you. Maybe you could tell a little bit about that, and even if you have the copy of his book there, maybe you could show that book and then the success that Todd has had.
Yeah. In fact, Todd is a interesting person. He came out here to the Heathman Ranch. He'd never written a book before. He's a very successful individual, Chris, as you well know, and he also has very big aspirations and very big goals as he comes into the space. So he came with the rough of idea of, I want to write a book, but didn't have a title, didn't have a chapter outline, and honestly really didn't know what he was going to write about. So through this process, 2 days, the drafted book experience, we developed this book called Relentless Success, a 9-point system for major league achievement. Now, this 9-point system that we created here during the drafted book experience is the same 9-point system that you'll get when you go and subscribe to his webinars, when you go to his live seminars, when you listen to his keynotes. He talks about this 9-point system. So all the things that come from the book will lead right into it. And it's interesting, Chris, that you bring this one up, because Todd is he's also an exceptional business guy. And he called me up 25 days after going through and after his book released. And he said that he's cash flow positive on his entire investment that he made in the book, and the inventory and the training that he received and all the editorial support, because of this exceptional system that was designed from the ground up. We'll be talking about that a little bit and how we go through that while you and I are having this conversation.
So when people start out writing a book, most people who have some level of ambition, they say, look, I don't want to just spend the money, get a book published, and then have it sit on racks in my garage. I want to be successful at it. I think I've got something unique to say, and hopefully Bryan and his team can pull something unique out of me and help me find that edge. But I'd like it to become a bestseller. And there's a couple different ways of looking at bestsellers. I've written 20-something books. I had one that was #2 on the Wall Street Journal, #7 on the New York Times, and #3 on Amazon. And I was on Amazon is #3 on Amazon, the entire site of Amazon. It was behind a pre-release of Harry Potter and the Lost Book of J.R.R. Tolkien that his grandson found after he died in his grandpa's attic. So I thought, well, I'm going to be #3 on Amazon. It may as well be the greatest fiction series of all time and one of the greatest writers of all time. But hitting #2 on the Wall Street Journal, #7 on the New York Times, #3 on Amazon did a lot for my career. It sold a lot of books. It gave me that cachet. And certainly everybody wants to hit those best-selling lists. But there are other lists as well. Most books are sold now through Amazon and online, and there are categories online on Amazon that are equally as important. Now, certainly, if you could be number one on Amazon, the entire site, that would be amazing. But if you could be, for example, maybe you're a life insurance salesman and you write a book and you're number one on business life insurance or insurance, you might say, well, okay, so I'm not, on the overall list. I didn't hit the New York Times, but you know what? People who are looking for books on insurance are going to see me, and I'm going to be able to say, hey, I was number one in that category, my book was, and that's going to position you as an authority in that particular realm, right? So it could be motivation, it could be child rearing, parenting, whatever it might be. It gives you that cachet of being a bestseller. So I know that you guys work with and target and help and strategize that, and you have what's called a 7-step process to becoming a bestseller. Why is it important to be thinking about that before you actually start writing?
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because about half the books that we receive here at Made for Success have already been written. But when people set out to write their first book, especially their first book, there's a number of things that are somewhat counterintuitive about writing books and about being a thought leader that need to get sorted out before the book gets published in order for it to have the bestseller potential. So when people come here to the ranch, one of the first things that we do is we take them through a program called the 7 Steps to a Bestseller. Now, in order to have a best-selling book, an author needs to take care of all 7 of these elements. All 7 have to be taken care of in order to have a best-selling. If you ignore just one of the elements of the 7 steps to a bestseller, your book will not go bestseller. Now, the first step in the 7 steps to a bestseller is that your book has to start with great writing. Now, why is that? So the book business is built around word of mouth advertising. So if you are writing a book and somebody says, hey, I just read this great book by Zig Ziglar called Born to Win, and I really think that this would be helpful for you and your business, you ought to read this. That's the way books are transacted, especially nonfiction books. So it's the word of mouth.
It's the way movies are sold. It's the way restaurants are sold. It's
Absolutely.
The way almost everything is sold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I love that you're talking about this because great movies get recommended. Nobody ever says, oh, I went and saw a bad movie, go see it. They always say, you wouldn't believe this great movie I just saw, go and see it. It's the same with books, so it's important to understand. Same with restaurants. Oh, man, we had an amazing meal. You've got to go and try it. It's the same way with books. You don't just throw your book on a shelf and it becomes a bestseller. So I love that you talk about it. You've got to be great.
Yeah. And, the 7 steps to a best-selling book are probably, Chris, almost identical to the 7 steps to a best-selling movie. So a best-selling book has to get into distribution. So here in Seattle, where I live, there's the Regal Cinemas and the iPic Cinemas. And if that movie doesn't get on those screens, I'll never see the movie, right? So if a book doesn't make it into bookstores, there's about 3,800 bookstores just in North America. If those books don't get into those stores, if it doesn't get into airport gift shops, if it doesn't get into Barnes & Noble, if it's not very cleverly merchandised in Amazon, the book will never have the potential.
Now, this is an important thing, I think, because I've been in the book business for a long time, as have you, and people say, well, I'm going to do it cheap. I don't want to spend the money on it. I'm going to use CreateSpace, or I'm going to use XYZ bookinaday.com publisher, some guy running it out of his garage and that kind of thing. And the real dirty little secret in this industry is that very, very, very few self-publishing or hybrid publishers, very few, tiny percentage, actually have distribution into the major networks of bookstores and both online and offline bookstores. Am I correct?
Yeah. In fact, if you just look at it statistically by the numbers, Chris, it's a great question. About 1% of nonfiction books that get written each year ever make it onto the shelves of the largest bookstore in North America, Barnes & Noble. 1%. Okay. And why is that? Well, there's about 300,000 nonfiction books written every year. How many books, Chris, do you guess are on the shelf at, or how many titles are on the shelf at Barnes & Noble, if you had to guess?
I would say less than probably 10 to 20,000 in a big Barnes & Noble.
So the biggest Barnes & Nobles will have 75,000 titles. Okay.
Oh, 75,000. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but that includes cookbooks, travel books, dictionaries, a huge section of fiction, a supply of business and self-help books, right?
Well, if you think about it, if you do the math, you think about it, if there's 300,000 a year that are written, in 10 years, that's 3 million, and there's 75,000 actually on a big bookstore, probably much less than that, you know, if you're thinking about, but it's not just per year. You got, in those bookstores, you have books that were written 10 years ago, 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
They're
In
taking
fact,
up space too.
yeah. So the evergreen bestsellers in the bookstores, like a Born to Win, you'll always find this book on the shelf because it's selling well. You'll always find in the business book category things like Good to Great, or 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or How to Win Friends and Influence People. And even some of your books are evergreen bestsellers, and they'll always be on the shelf at Barnes & Noble. So the number of new books that cut in is very limited, and it's very competitive. So when we take a look at this process, we know that there are hoops that we've got to jump through in order to get that book on the shelf, and we have to do everything perfectly in order to get that book on the shelf and to get it stay in the sun. Now, if we do our job really well, and your book becomes a bestseller, and it goes to become an evergreen bestseller like Born to Win, it leads to tremendous opportunities for the author. And Chris, you know this better than anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, I built my career to where I'm getting $20,000 to show up and give an hour-long speech. If I go outside the country, it's $35,000 to give a speech. Consulting projects, coaching, people, my coaching programs start at $12,500 a year. And most of that credibility that has given me those opportunities stems from the fact that I've been writing books and traveling the world and speaking on the topics of those books. So, okay, so we've got great writing, we've got great distribution. What's next?
So one of the other things that's kind of an intangible, most people don't think about this, Chris, when they set out to write their book, especially if they're writing their first book, but it's, what does my brand as an author represent? Well, here's the challenge that all of us have in the process of writing books, is that we are all hit with about 3,000 advertising messages per day. And in order for get a message to sink through the clutter of this overstimulation that we have, our brands have to be memorable. We have to stand for something, we have to represent something, and then we need to be able to message that very clearly. So one of the guys that just came through in 2018, whose book went #1 bestseller on Amazon, is a chess master. He's a master at playing chess, right? And his name is Elliot Neff. When he came in, I knew that we had to create his author brand so that people would remember it and aspire to recommend the book, buy the book, read it, recommend it. And it was a true challenge, because not often does a chess master have a personality like a Chris Widener, bigger than life and dynamic and these kind of things. So we had to dress up his brand and make it memorable in the marketplace. So that's another thing that we do focus on when people come to the ranch for the drafted book experience. We focus in on the author branding, and that's kind of a unique way of thinking when it relates to writing a book. What does having a great brand relate to having a great book? Well, it's everything once you get down the road a few steps.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the webinar as well, specifically about branding. All right, what's next?
All right. So one of the other often overlooked aspects is who we're writing the book to. So that's the target audience. So when you think about a book, most people think, well, if I write a book, I want everybody to read my book. But the opposite, the exact opposite, is true in the book industry. Books are written in what I call micro niches. So we're working on a book that will most likely go bestseller in 2019. If you're watching this video in 2019, be on the lookout for a book called The Success Lie. This book we're putting a lot of muscle behind this, and it's going to be doing some interesting things. But The Success Lie isn't written for everybody. It's written towards business owners who have achieved extraordinary success and have found it almost empty. And it's an interesting thing, Chris. In fact, one of your stories inspired the way that we position this book. So you grew up here in Washington State, not too far from where I'm sitting here today. And for years, you told me you would drive by this Spanish castle that's off on the left-hand side on the river, sitting on this beautiful 10-acre lot. And you finally hit that success that you were looking for.
Yeah,
you
for
bought the
21
house.
years, I drove by that house. 21 years, from the time I was 17 till the time I was 38.
Yeah.
And I finally bought it. And it was, you've been there many times, it was an extraordinary home, extraordinary property. And I know what story you're going to tell, so finish.
Yeah. So the story that's kind of funny is that after 21 years of driving by this house and dreaming, and, you know, the huge wine cellar that was in the basement, and the pool house and the swimming pool and the gazebo and the giant rhododendrons and the huge yard and whatnot, you buy the house. And you're standing there on one summer day with your hands on your hips, and you're looking at this 10-acre spread that you just bought. And the thought that goes through your head was, is this all there is? Is there more? So thinking through these things thinking about this really narrow target audience, this book actually was The Success Lie, was inspired based on your story. It's the people who have achieved the pinnacle success and have been left going, is this all there is to achieving my dreams?
Yeah,
So,
and this was literally like 2 weeks after I bought the home. And I remember looking at it and going, now what? Right? Like, what do I do now? This took me 21 years. Okay,
right.
great. So let's move on. What's the next thought in regards to the 7 steps to a bestseller?
Yeah. So one of the other things to understand about books is the different kinds of book derivatives. So right now where I'm sitting, you can't see all the equipment that's surrounding me here in Studio A, here in Made for Success Publishing Studios, but this is where we do all of our audiobook recording, okay? And the components of a best-selling book include things like the hardcover derivative. You know, this is what we call a book jacket, which is the wrapper that goes around a hardcover bound book. Then you've got the paperback derivative of a book and all the different components. We think about things like whether it should be color inside or should it be black and white, how many units are we going to print, what's the page count, what's the thickness of the spine, all these things kind of go through. And then we think about the audiobook recording. So this is another really important kind of thing to think about up front while you're thinking about your overall strategy for your book and how it's going to be profitably supporting your aspirations to be a thought leader or your aspirations to use the book as a way to drive revenues for your business. So we walk through a comprehensive training so that when you leave, you'll have a very clear picture of all the moving parts in the $27 billion industry here in the US and $143 billion industry worldwide of all the things that make the book industry tick.
Okay, so I think we've got a couple more. What are the last couple here for the 7 steps to a best-selling book?
Yeah, so I won't go through all the 7 steps of a bestseller here, but we do talk about the cover design. We talk about the interior layout. We talk about the pricing for the book. We talk about the target audience. We talk about how the messaging should get unpacked. But you know, one of the things I think that would be kind of interesting to talk about, Chris, while we've got this time together, is to talk about the different writing styles. In fact, You know, some people watching this will be thinking, well, what kind of book should I write? Should I write the next great American novel, like a fiction novel, or should I be thinking about a nonfiction book, which are kind of more aligned with what you write, Chris? Or should I be thinking about a like a parable and that style of writing? So I would love to talk about that. So before we kick that off, Chris, let's hear about your writing style with the angel inside, because it's kind of a unique way to write a book. And then I'll
Yeah,
tell you a little bit more.
The Angel Inside, which is it's actually, it hasn't sold the most copies of any book. My book that I wrote with Jim Rohn called The 12 Pillars is my #1 best-selling book in terms of numbers, but it didn't hit any of the lists because we self-published it. We sell it in bulk to network marketing companies and some of those groups, corporations, etc. But the books that I did through a traditional publisher, which got on the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, was a book called The Angel Inside. It was the first parable that I wrote. And I've written many parable books now. The 12 Pillars was a parable book, The Image, Leadership Rules, The Art of Influence, many books in that sort of genre. And it comes out of the style of Og Mandino, who wrote Greatest Salesman and The Choice, and some of those books that teach life or business lessons, but through a fictional story. So The Angel Inside, which was a book. It was also an audio book. It was optioned as a movie. Has not been made yet as a movie, but hoping still for that to happen someday. The whole book is like 20,000 words, so it's a short book, and the entire book takes place in an afternoon in Italy. One afternoon in Italy where a young man meets an older man, and the older man teaches the younger man life lessons from the life of Michelangelo and the creation of the David, which in Florence, Italy is where the David still resides. And I take that back. The last 2 or 3 pages of the book are the next morning before the young man flies back to the U.S. But the entire book is one afternoon in Italy, and there are 2 characters in the book, and it's the afternoon they spend together and the lessons that are learned that the old man teaches the young man, and it's all fictional.
Yeah. So when you're setting off to write a book, there's all these various components to be thinking about in terms of what's going to make the book successful. And when you look at the writing styles, that's something that we do focus in on. In fact, there's 12 different ways to write a nonfiction book, which is kind of an interesting way to think about the whole process of writing. So we try to figure out which one of those 12 different writing styles is going to be right for your book. Should it be a biography? Should it be an autobiography? Should it be a parable? Should it be written in self-help style? Should it be a picture book? And all these various things. But the important thing, and one of the things that's actually kind of unique, Chris, to what we do here in the Drafted Book Experience is that we base the writing style on a storytelling method. Some people have heard of story brand and the kind of the storytelling method of that method, but we've developed kind of a proprietary system using the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey is was basically developed by this guy named Joseph Campbell back in, let's see, what was it? It was back in 1949. And he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And if you were to go out and pick up that book, it would kind of bend your mind. It's kind of philosophical. It's the type of thing that if you were going to USC film school, they would force you to read this and write papers on it. But we've modified that into a 12-step system for writing nonfiction books that basically create the arc of a story that's so compelling, Chris, that it's hard to set down the book. So that's the magic. That's the magic of the things that were behind Relentless Success. This book was developed or designed after the hero's journey, where there's a number of stories and plots and whatnot that kind of come along the way, so that when you end the chapter, you can't wait to read the next chapter. Okay, so this is one of the unique elements of using a high-end expert like myself to get your book written versus various other means that you can use to write a book.
So a lot of people will, they'll say, okay, I got a general idea, but I want to tell a story. And I don't necessarily mean fictional story, but even nonfiction books are filled with stories that help make the point, right? And
Yep.
so let's talk about how you help people cultivate what you call, I think you call it the story inventory.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, here's the thing. The story inventory, which is one of the elements that we'll spend time on here when you come to Seattle to go through the Draft a Book experience, is developing an inventory of stories that will probably be one of the most valuable assets to your writing and speaking career. And Chris, I love this story from your perspective. So first, let me tell you what the story is, and then I'll what the story inventory is, and then we'll talk about Chris's experience. So the story inventory is a list of all the stories that you want to bring out in your book. In fact, one of the philosophies that I teach, and you might even want to jot this down, is never tell a story without making a point, and never make a point without telling a story. So you know how you've gone to a speech, and the speaker is up there and they're talking about the 5 points of the elements of, you know, the 5 points of influence, Chris, which are some of the things that you teach when you speak. But it's typically that one story that sinks in, that starts up here and comes about 18 inches down and settles in your heart. Those are the ones that we go off and we tell our friends, and we go, oh my gosh, I heard the speech, and the speaker told this story and it was amazing, and here's what it was. So those stories are important. They're not only important for the elements within your book, they're not only important as I help people structure the table of contents in the writing plan, but this story inventory comes in handy when you're on stage. Now, Chris, one of the stories that you shared with me when you were on a big stage, I think you were in front of 6,000 people at this particular event, and you were in the middle of your keynote speech, and they gave you a 45-minute slot to do your speech. And as you're just getting ready to wrap up your 45-minute speech, would you rehearsed and you practiced and you got it down, because this was a big stage that you were sharing with US presidents and other big names within the speaking business, out of the corner of your eye, you saw the meeting planner going like this: keep going, keep going, keep going. So you're at the end of your speech, right? And all of a sudden, out of the corner of your eye, you're seeing somebody saying, keep talking, keep talking. And you had to speak for another 20 minutes, right? So what tricks did you use? How did you come up with 20 minutes worth of new material that you hadn't rehearsed? Well,
You tell stories. I mean,
tell
that's basically what it is. You tell stories, right? You just start going, okay, here's what I've talked about. And typically my speeches and other people's speeches, you say don't make a point without telling a story, don't tell a story without making a point. So in my primary keynotes, I have 4 points, and each of those points has a story that I tell to sort of implement that or give them an example or an analogy or something like that. And so, you know, at the end, I can't remember exactly whether it was that I just added on a couple more points. You know, here's a couple of other things that I want to throw in as bonuses, and then emphasized with a story. Or if I went back and said, you know what, I want to tell you another story about point number 2. I can't remember exactly which one I did, but both of them revolved around the fact that you had to tell a story. Now, one of the things that has been said, I didn't make it up, but people say facts tell, stories sell. And when you think about it, you know, the greatest speakers of all time, and probably undoubtedly, whether you believe in him or not or whatever, the greatest speaker and made the most impact on the world, a guy named Jesus. And Jesus just told stories, right? Jesus didn't say, let me give you 7 tips on how to be happy. Happy tip number 1. No, what Jesus said was, it's sort of like a farmer. And the farmer goes out and he grabs a bag of seed and he starts sowing that seed. He tells a story, right? Because people connect with those kinds of stories. When I look at the great speakers and authors of our time, Zig Ziglar, I read once about a research project, and I ended up talking to the woman who did the research project. She took, I think, 20 professional speakers at various amounts of speakers' fees. So Zig Ziglar was the top one. He was making $100,000 a speech, all the way down to people that nobody'd ever heard of who were getting paid $1,500 a speech. So she had a $1,500, a $3, a $5, a $7,500, $10, all the way up to $100. Then they listened to each of the keynotes, and then they took a stopwatch to the keynote, and every moment that the person was telling a story, the stopwatch was going, and when they stopped telling a story, the stopwatch stopped. When they started another story, the stopwatch went, and they added up the time that the person spent telling stories. Now, here was the really interesting conclusion. Out of these 20 speakers, except for one, there was one anomaly. The highest paid speaker told the most stories, all the way down to the lowest paid speaker told the least amount of stories. There was one in there that was sort of flip-flop, but Zig, I think something like 85% of his entire speech in terms of the time spent speaking was stories, all the way down to the person who was making like $1,500 a speech, which was almost 85% giving facts and things like that, with only 15% stories. So it's important for us to understand that even if you're writing a nonfiction book, you still want to have stories, because that's what people relate to.
Right. In fact, that's the key. And so the whole process of creating ideas and then documenting your story inventory is a very powerful part of the writing process, but then it comes in downstream as you start to record your own webinars, as you start to build your own online membership courses, as you're doing your keynote speeches. These are the types of things that really will resonate. And these story inventory also come in powerful when you do your television interviews, and when you're doing your radio interviews, or if you're doing a podcast tour as a way to promote your book. These stories become really powerful. But
okay,
Chris,
go ahead.
Yeah, so let's talk about the writing plan. Because
that's what I was going to ask you, because people say, okay, whether I do this myself or I use you, Bryan, to go through this process, great. I got a title. I have my stories I want to tell. They still have to sit down and write it. They have to have a plan. People say to me all the time, how'd you write 21 books? And I tell them, one word at a time, one keystroke at a time. And if you don't have discipline, you don't have a plan, and frankly, this is the same with losing weight or saving money or building a good relationship with your spouse. The people who have a plan are the people who succeed. So tell us about having a writing plan.
Yeah, well, and that's just it, Chris, is that writing a book is what I call the territory of the ambitious. It's the type of project that an ambitious person takes on. And the reason why everybody doesn't write a book, despite the fact that 82% would like to write a book about some of the interesting parts of their story, is because it does take some discipline and some sacrifice. Knowing that, though, and knowing that just about everybody that comes in through Made for Success is successful, and they're very busy. Where are we going to find time to squeeze in writing a book? So we've designed it where we create a document, and the document serves as a checklist. We call it the writing plan. And the writing plan is broken down into small 800-word pieces. Now, Chris, you know exactly how long it takes to write 800 words because you've written 21 books. But for the average person, we don't know how long it takes to write 800 words. Well, 800 words is about the same kind of weight as writing a really long email. So if you're thinking through, we break it down into writing chunks of really long emails. Then we put together a schedule. And the thing that really works well for most of the authors that come through us is we create a schedule where they're carving out a certain number of hours per week. And we set a goal for their writing each week as they get their writing going. Now, at the end of this, we give them a 90-day timeline to write their book, because everybody has incredibly busy schedules. They're either the CEO of their company, they're traveling all the time because they're speaking, and they've got a lot of distractions. And then there's life, and there's their children and their grandchildren, and all the things that kind of come in as life starts to interact. But what I've discovered after years and years and years of guiding people through the drafted book experience is that the 90-day time frame is the perfect time frame to work a book, get it finished on top of a busy schedule. Whether you're working on an IPO for your company, or you've got an incredibly robust sales territory that you're working, or if you're touring as a musician or an athlete, you can still get these books written inside this 90-day by following this system. Now, the other thing that's part of kind of the magic of this is that we assign an editor to the author during this 90-day period so that there's accountability. And as they're writing, they're getting real-time feedback on all the things that they don't know about writing. Because I'm taking people who are symphony conductors or athletes or professional speakers, and I'm basically teaching them the subtleties of what it's like to write, but to write it well. In fact, writing it so well that it's got bestseller potential. Okay. So at the end of this 90 days, we're done. We're ready to go, and we're ready to jump into the next season of getting the book published. And there's a whole number of things that we'll talk about that as the process moves along. But that's really the essence of it. It's having a really good writing plan that's organized and broken down into small chunks, and then working that plan over a 90-day period. Now, there's going to be a number of people that are watching this webinar who will say, well, what about just getting a ghostwriter to work on the book? And Chris, you've done a little ghostwriting in the past. Let's just hear about some of your ghostwriting experience, and then we'll talk about using a ghostwriter.
Yeah, I got my start. Well, I didn't get my start, but my career really started to catapult when I started ghostwriting for a major best-selling author. I think he's probably got 30 million books in print now. Then I was asked to write with some other legendary people, and so I don't do ghostwriting anymore. But I certainly took a major leap forward when I started ghostwriting for some big players in the personal development leadership world. That got me into a realm of people that helped improve my career and move me forward.
Yeah. In fact, some of the things that you were ghostwriting early on when you and I started working together were things that were kind of really cemented your success within the highly competitive industry of professional speaking. So it was interesting. But so for some people, a ghostwriter is the right mix. We'll talk about that as we go through. But even if you do use a ghostwriter, you've got to have a really good plan of what that person is going to write about. And we've got to have great documentation. And there's a different track that we take those people through that do want to work with a ghostwriter, but it's very, very similar to this whole thing that we've designed with the drafted book experience.
Now, folks, as it is with almost anything, you have I can do it myself, or I can have a partner do it with me, or some people do it all for you. I mean, there are people, I imagine, where somebody could say, I'm a CEO of a major corporation. Here's the 7 things I want to teach people. Go hire a ghostwriter and send me the book when it's done. The totally done for you kind of thing. But the done with you is really what you focus on, Bryan, as opposed to the just go do it myself. There's lots of people who think, well, I'll just do it myself. The problem is that you're still going to end up having to do all these things that Bryan talked about. You're going to have to develop the stories. You're going to have to hire an editor. I mean, you're going to have an editor whether you work with a guy like Bryan or not, right? And so we should do another webinar on what to do once you get the book written, like the marketing and what you guys do with marketing, because I know you have a huge component of your business that once the book is written, you can also help them with their book marketing and things like that. But all of the things that you talked about today are key components. You've got to be a great writer. You've got to have a great brand. You've got to learn those stories. You've got to have that decision about whether you're going to do fiction or nonfiction. You got to have an editor, all of those kinds of things. You got to have a plan for sure. And so if people would like to work with you, Bryan, I've developed with you a less expensive price It was, some people are shocked kind of how expensive it can be to participate with book publishers. I literally had a guy the other day, I kid you not, this is absolute 100% true, called me up. He said, Chris, I've been screwed. This guy took me for a lot of money. And he told me I was going to have a best-selling book and all this. And I said to him, I said, how much? And I thought he was going to probably say, you know, $125,000. I kid you not. This man said to me, $400,000.
Wow.
I got a pit in my stomach, and I just went, unbelievable. I said, dude, that's a house. And he said, I know. And he's an affluent, very successful business entrepreneur, so he had the money, but still $400,000.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot of money. For a lot of people are charging a lot of money. Typically, you are charging $40,000 for this weekend, and then the process of the 90 days includes the editor and those kinds of things. But because I came to you and said, I want to do a webinar, I want to help people, I want to do it for lots less than that. And so you have swiped out nearly half of that price tag. And so if people want to talk to you and they know that there's an investment, folks, there is an investment. So don't, you know, waste anybody's time if you're just like, oh, I don't have two nickels to rub together. But if you are serious about getting your book out and making 2019 that year that you finally get that book out, and you want a partner and you want somebody who's going to help you, and you're going to go spend a couple of days up in the Seattle area at the Heathman Ranch and really come away with a plan like you saw Todd Stottlemyre, like Zig Ziglar's book, Born to Win, a number of other authors. One of your recent authors who I know went through the process, Scott Hogel, I saw his book was just in Costco. So,
yeah.
you know, amazing opportunity that people have. All you have to do, there's a button on this page and it says, yes, please contact me, or I'd like more information. All you have to do is hit that button, give your information. Either Bryan or one of Bryan's team will contact you and will set up an opportunity for you to discuss this opportunity and the potential of working together and having you come out to the Heathman Ranch and going through the Draft a Book experience. If you say to yourself, nah, I'm going to wing it, well, good luck, and we hope that you can do it. But I'll tell you what, one of the things I've realized in my career is you put good teams together. I'm involved right now in the creation of a startup company with millions of dollars at stake from investors, and I just said we got to put together a world-class team, which means you got to invest some money. And so we're putting together a world-class team. Bryan and his team, a world-class team. It's who I do my books with, and they're going to give you a significant reduction in the price of this Draft a Book experience. So if you'd like to do that, hit the button. Bryan and his team will get a hold of you as soon as possible. What, if anything, do you have to say in conclusion for folks as we wrap up the webinar?
Well, Chris, one of the things that you mentioned was making 2019 your best year ever. And as we're kind of in this time of year, in this season, and you're looking at your goals for the next 2019, 2020, and if you're thinking about things that you want to do that will have significance on society, things that you will do to spread ideas and make society a better place, we would love to hear from you. We'll definitely have one of our staff members get back to you and spend a little time with you as we work through this. You know, our scheduling and our calendar, we'll work through all those kind of details about what works into your calendar and what works into ours to get you set up so that we can get 2019 started the best way that it can. And doing work of significance, when you think about, you know, all the things that you could do, whether you take guitar lessons or if you learn how to drive a race car, or, you know, any of the number of things that we set out for our goals, getting a book written is one of the most significant things that you can do, bar none.
Okay, good. Well, folks, that's the end of the webinar. Be sure to hit that button if you're serious and you want to start a serious discussion. There's no obligation to talk to them, but you certainly need to know that we're not just looking for tire kickers. We're looking for somebody who's actually really interested, wants to improve their life, improve their business, make a mark on the world. Go ahead and hit that. And Bryan, thanks a lot for joining me on the webinar.
You bet, Chris. This is a pleasure.